So moving over to video number 2 now. So in this video I just wanted to talk about a few things that I've been thinking about lately in reference to autism and why I feel that it's a major mistake to lump such disparate conditions together. So I've been thinking a lot about this lately and I came up with an analogy, okay? So my analogy is to do with, so if we were to take, say, a physical illness, and the analogy I was thinking was, say, the relationship between colds and influenza. Okay? So both colds and influenza are respiratory viruses. I think most people know that. They're both respiratory viruses. That's that if we look at it at a macro level, okay? But if we were to zone in closer and look at them closer up, we realise that influenza and flu are not the same. Yes, they both belong to the category of respiratory viruses, and yes, they can both have some similar symptoms. But they're not the same virus. They're completely different viruses. So we could say, on one level, hypothetically speaking, that someone who isn't very educated and who doesn't realise that colds and flu are different viruses might say that a cold is a mild form of flu. That wouldn't actually make sense, because a cold is not the flu. So how can it be a mild form of flu if a cold is not the flu? That wouldn't make sense. You could, with more justification, say that colds are milder than flu. On one level, yes, that is true. Colds, generally speaking, because there are exceptions, sometimes colds can actually lead to pneumonia and the person can die if they've got a very weak immune system, but generally speaking, colds are milder than flu, on general. But that information doesn't help someone who's suffering from a very severe cold that maybe is going on and on and on. And likewise, sometimes flu can be very, very mild, depending on the person's immune system. So these are all averages, and they don't always apply. But nevertheless, we can still say that on average, colds are milder than flu. That is true in the sense that saying a cold is a mild form of flu is not true. Saying a cold is a mild form of flu is not true, because they're different viruses. But you could say that on average colds are milder than flu. That would be a true statement on average. So I took this analogy because I was thinking that we could say a similar thing about autism. Okay, now it's often said that Asperger's syndrome, when we used to have categories, we don't have categories anymore, we're lumping it all together as autism, but that would be a bit like saying that colds and the flu are all the same and we're not having demarcations between them, which would be absolutely loony. But we used to say, when we had Asperger's as a category distinct from other types of autism, we might say, oh, Asperger's is a mild form of autism. Now, that statement would only be true if Asperger's and the other types of autism were the same. Because in the same sense that it would only make sense to say that a cold is a mild form of flu if colds and flu were the same virus, which they're not. So saying Asperger's is a mild form of autism would only make sense if Asperger's and the other types of autism were actually the same condition. In the same sense that you could say, influenza C is generally milder than influenza A. And that would be logically coherent because it's the same condition. You can only make comparisons like that when something is homogeneous enough to make the comparison. Otherwise you're creating a category mistake, quite simple. So basically we don't actually know enough yet about autism to actually know whether or not we're talking about the same condition. We don't know that. People often talk as if we know it all and it's all been sorted. It's just one condition, it's a continuum from mild to severe. Because it would only make sense if it was a homogenous enough category for you to do that. And there's no evidence to show that that's the case. If anything, the evidence seems to suggest quite the opposite. So, saying Asperger's is a mild form of classic autism has as much veracity as saying that colds are milder than flu. Say if Asperger's is like a cold to classic autism's flu. Yeah, it would be preferable to have a cold than to have flu, certainly. I'd rather have a cold than have flu. But a cold can still be very nasty, so that doesn't... So it's only mild in one sense. It's only mild relative to what you're comparing it to. But it can still, on its own terms, be very severe. As indeed, how I experience it for myself and my life is pretty severe. You know I'm not as severe as someone who needs 24/7 care and who can't speak and all the rest, but that's a different condition to what I have. And that wouldn't make me feel better if I'm suffering with a bad cold to think that at least it isn't flu. I mean, I suppose maybe on one level I could say that, but it's only going to help so much, isn't it? It's not really going to help the person who's struggling, is it? So I don't actually think it's very helpful to do that, really, when it comes to autism. And I certainly don't think it's helpful to treat autism as the same condition when there's no evidence to show it is the same condition. Another analogy would be to compare schizophrenia and depression, which can both share similar symptoms, often like negative effect, I think, in both conditions is quite common. Some people might say schizophrenia is a worse mental illness than depression. In some respects it can be more severe, but people who are depressed can still commit suicide, and depression can still be very severe on its own terms. Schizophrenia is not a form of depression. They're distinct conditions with different pathways, different causes, but they might possibly in some people be genetically related in some groups. So say if Asperger's is to classic autism, what depression is to schizophrenia. How do we know that that's not the case? We wouldn't say depression is a mild form of schizophrenia because that wouldn't make sense because they're not the same condition. We might say legitimately that depression is usually milder than schizophrenia, but again, that isn't really going to help too much for the person who's battling with depression and who might be suicidal, for whom it's actually pretty severe. And actually might, in that case, actually be just as severe as schizophrenia, but in a different way. So, yeah, so it actually becomes very unhelpful. So think about that. The other thing I wanted to say, though, is with regards to functioning labels, okay? Now, some people, particularly in the neurodiversity movement, want to get rid of functioning labels, like completely. Like, I don't want them at all. Just get rid of them completely. That's like quite a sweeping thing. Just get rid of functioning labels. Personally, and I've been thinking about this quite a lot, I actually think functioning labels, I think that functioning labels are both relative and absolute. Something can be relative and absolute at the same time. If you think, say, about height, for example, height is both relative and absolute. It's both a binary and a continuum. Now, when we're comparing between categories, so when we're saying that Asperger's is a form of autism or Asperger's is a high-functioning form of autism, when we don't know that they're the same condition, I'm not so sure that functioning labels really mean very much, because they only would mean much if they're the same condition. And